For most of my life, I was known by a name I never chose. Not my first name, not my job title, just the family's shame. It was a word my father used easily publicly, as if it explained everything about me, why I was quiet, why I stayed away, why no one ever asked what I was really doing with my life. The night he said it again louder than ever in front of people whose opinions mattered, I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply left, carrying the familiar weight of humiliation I had learned to survive in silence. What no one knew was that my silence wasn't weakness. It was distance. It was preparation. Because less than 24 hours later, the man who had spent years calling me a disgrace stood in front of me again, this time with a different voice, different posture, and a single word he struggled to say. Boss. That moment didn't feel like victory. It felt like truth finally catching up. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, in a neighborhood where every house looked like it belonged to a brochure. Neatly cut lawns, American flags on porches. Parents who waved politely and pretended everything inside their homes was just as orderly. My father cared deeply about that image. To him, respect didn't come from kindness or understanding. It came from status, confidence, and how loudly you could claim success. Inside our house, his presence filled every room. He wasn't violent or explosive. He didn't need to be. His authority lived in his certainty. When he spoke, it wasn't an opinion, it was a conclusion. And once he decided who you were, there was no appeal process. I was the youngest of three. My brother came first, and with him came pride. He was outspoken, competitive, always looking for the next big thing. My father saw himself in that. My sister followed, driven, organized, sharp in ways that earned praise easily. She knew how to perform ambition the way my father respected. Then there was me. I wasn't rebellious. I wasn't lazy. I just didn't fit the shape my father believed success should take. I asked questions instead of making declarations. I listened more than I spoke. I noticed details others ignored. From a young age, I could feel the difference in how he looked at me, like he was waiting for something that never arrived. At first, it showed up as comparison. Your brother already knew what he wanted by your age. Your sister doesn't second-guess herself like that. Why do you always hesitate? Those words settled into me slowly, quietly. They didn't explode. They sank. I learned early that defending myself only made things worse. Any explanation sounded like an excuse to him. Any emotion sounded like weakness. So I stopped offering both. At the dinner table, my father liked to ask questions that felt harmless on the surface. What are your plans? What are you thinking of doing next? But the answers were never enough. If I spoke carefully, he said, I lacked confidence. If I spoke honestly, he said I lacked direction. No version of myself passed his test. By the time I reached high school, I understood my role. I was the child he didn't quite know what to do with. Teachers praised me for my GPA. I stayed out of trouble. I worked part-time after school and saved what little money I earned. None of that impressed him. Those things were invisible because they weren't loud. When college came up, the gap between us widened permanently. My brother chose a business program my father approved of immediately. Expensive, recognizable, impressive to strangers. My sister followed a similar path, and my father spoke about their futures, like investments he was proud to show off. When it was my turn to talk, I said I wanted to study something quieter, more technical, something that would take time to grow into. My father smiled, but it wasn't warm. That's not ambition, he said. That's hiding. I paid for school myself through scholarships, part-time work, and student loans I never mentioned at family gatherings. I moved out earlier than expected, not because of a dramatic argument, but because I needed space to breathe. Every mile away from that house felt like relief I didn't have to justify. Still, the label followed me. At holidays and birthdays, I became background noise. My father spoke proudly about my siblings' internships, their starting salaries, their promotions. When relatives asked about me, he answered before I could. They're still figuring things out. They're not very driven. Sometimes he laughed when he said it, like it was a harmless observation. Other times, he sounded disappointed, as if my existence was a long-term inconvenience. I learned how to make myself small in those rooms. I smiled politely. I answered briefly. I left early. No confrontations. No raised voices. I understood that fighting his narrative would only make it stronger. After graduation, I took a job that didn't impress anyone. The title was ordinary. The salary was modest. I rented a small apartment, drove a used car, and kept my expenses low. My father saw exactly what he expected to see. "You're wasting your potential," he told me once, shaking his head. "If you even have any." That was the moment the word shame first took shape, even if he didn't say it yet. It hovered over every conversation after that, in the pauses, in the sighs, in the way he introduced me to others without enthusiasm. What he never noticed was that while he measured success by noise and speed, I was learning something else entirely. I was learning systems, how decisions were made, how money moved quietly before anyone celebrated it, how people with real authority rarely announced themselves. I worked long hours without complaining. I learned skills no one at home cared about. I built relationships that didn't need validation. When opportunities came, I accepted them without posting, without calling home, without asking permission. My life became something private, not secret protected. Years passed that way. Enough years that my family stopped expecting change from me. Enough years that my father stopped asking questions altogether. In his mind, I had settled permanently into the role he assigned me. The irony was that his dismissal gave me something invaluable: freedom. No one was watching closely anymore. No one questioned where I was going or who I was meeting. No one noticed the certifications I earned quietly, the contracts I reviewed late at night, or the responsibilities that slowly began to stack on my calendar. No one noticed when my financial reality shifted because they had already decided who I was. I didn't hide out of revenge. I hid out of habit, out of survival. At family events, the same words followed me. The quiet one, the one who never quite made it, the disappointment. By the time my father finally said the word shame out loud, it didn't surprise me. It confirmed what I had lived with for years, that in his story I had already failed. What he didn't know was that my silence wasn't emptiness. It was restraint, and it was temporary. By the time I entered my mid-20s, my life had settled into a rhythm that looked unimpressive to anyone watching from the outside. I worked a job that didn't come with a title worth mentioning. My email signature didn't impress. My business cards, when I had them, were plain. I rented a modest apartment about 30 minutes from downtown, close enough to commute, far enough to disappear when I needed to. That distance mattered. It meant I could build a life without my father's commentary echoing through every decision. No one questioned why I stayed late. No one mocked what I chose to study after work. No one asked why I spent weekends reading contracts instead of socializing. The silence gave me room to think. From the outside, I looked stuck. From the inside, I was deliberate. My father, of course, interpreted my quiet progress as stagnation. Whenever we spoke, which grew less frequent over time, he asked the same questions with the same tone. "So, what are you doing now?" Not "how are you?" Not "are you happy?" Just that. "What are you doing now?" If I answered honestly, he dismissed it. If I simplified it, he nodded as if it confirmed everything he already believed. Eventually, I learned to answer vaguely. "Still working. Still working." Two words that ended the conversation quickly. Family gatherings became exercises in restraint. My siblings spoke loudly about their promotions, their raises, their plans. Numbers were exchanged openly: salary figures, bonuses, job titles that sounded impressive. My father leaned in during those conversations, proud and engaged. When it came to me, the energy shifted. I was asked fewer questions. Sometimes none at all. If someone did ask, my father stepped in. "They're doing their own thing," he'd say. "You know how they are." The phrase carried a finality that discouraged follow-ups, and I was grateful for that. The less attention on me, the better. What my family didn't understand was that I wasn't avoiding effort. I was avoiding noise. I worked long hours without announcing them. I accepted responsibilities that didn't come with immediate recognition but offered long-term leverage. I learned how to read people in meetings, how to listen for what wasn't being said, how to recognize when someone underestimated me, and how to let them. Underestimation became an asset. There were nights I came home exhausted, questioning whether my approach made sense. Nights when doubt crept in, whispering my father's words back to me in my own voice. "You're hiding. You're wasting time. You don't have what it takes." Those were the hardest moments, not because they were loud, but because they were familiar. I had grown up with that voice. It knew how to sound convincing. Still, I didn't call home for reassurance. I didn't ask for validation. I reminded myself that the life I was building wasn't meant to be explained at a dinner table. It was meant to stand on its own. Slowly, quietly, it began to. Opportunities didn't arrive with fanfare. They came through emails that asked for discretion, through meetings that weren't publicized, through contracts that required signatures instead of applause. I learned quickly that the most powerful rooms weren't the loudest ones. And I learned something else too. The people who mattered didn't need me to perform confidence. They valued consistency, follow through, silence when it was appropriate. That suited me. My father, meanwhile, grew more distant. He stopped offering advice, stopped criticizing openly. In some ways, that hurt more than his words ever had. His silence wasn't respect, it was dismissal. I had become irrelevant in his mental map of success. Once during a rare phone call, he said it plainly. I just don't worry about you anymore. He meant it as honesty, maybe even kindness. To me, it sounded like erasure. I hung up afterward and sat alone in my apartment for a long time staring at the wall. Not angry, just hollow. There's a particular kind of pain that comes from realizing someone has given up on you not because you failed, but because they decided you were no longer worth measuring. That night, I didn't make any dramatic decisions. I didn't vow revenge. I didn't fantasize about proving him wrong. I simply returned to my routine the next morning. Work, learning, preparation. Because deep down, I understood something my father never had. Progress doesn't always announce itself. As the years passed, my life began to split into two versions. The public one my family saw frozen in their assumptions, and the private one I lived daily, full of responsibilities, expectations, and pressure that no one back home would have recognized. I carried that duality quietly. It taught me discipline. It taught me patience. It also taught me how fragile my family's perception of me really was. They didn't know where I went during the week. They didn't know who depended on my decisions. They didn't know the scale of what I was involved in because they had stopped asking long ago. And I let them. Not because I wanted to deceive them, but because I didn't owe them visibility. I had learned the hard way that visibility in my family invited judgment, not understanding. So I stayed quiet. I showed up when expected. I smiled when required. I accepted my assigned seat at the table and kept my answers short. Inside, though, something steady was forming. Confidence without noise. Strength without display. I didn't know exactly when the balance would shift. I didn't know when my father's certainty would finally collide with reality. I only knew that when it did, it wouldn't be because I demanded recognition. It would be because truth doesn't stay hidden forever. And when that moment came, I would meet it the same way I met everything else. Calm, prepared, silent. The night everything cracked open didn't begin with tension. That was the cruel part. It began like every other family gathering, predictable, controlled, rehearsed. It was a late fall weekend, and my parents were hosting a dinner to celebrate my sister's recent promotion. Nothing extravagant, just close family and a few friends my father liked to impress. The house hadn't changed much since I moved out. Same furniture, same framed photos arranged like a resume of my siblings' achievements. I noticed, as I always did, how few of those photos included me. I arrived on time. Not early, not late. I had learned that timing mattered with my father. Early looked eager. Late looked irresponsible. On time meant invisible, and invisibility had become my safest position. At first, everything followed the familiar script. Drinks were poured. Compliments were exchanged. My father moved through the room confidently telling the same stories he always told, stories where he was the center, the authority, the proof that his family was successful because of him. I stayed near the edge of the room, listening more than speaking. When someone asked how I was doing, I answered politely and briefly. I didn't offer details. I never did. As the evening went on, the conversation grew louder. My father had been drinking not enough to slur his words, but enough to loosen his restraint. That was when he was most honest. Or at least most careless. Someone mentioned career paths. Someone else joked about how different siblings could turn out so differently. It was harmless at first. Casual laughter. Then my father glanced in my direction. He didn't look angry. He looked amused. You know, he said, gesturing toward me with his glass, every family has one. The room quieted just enough for his voice to carry. What someone asked. He smiled, that familiar smile that never quite reached his eyes. One disappointment, he said. The one who never really figures it out. There was a brief, uncomfortable laugh from someone near the kitchen. My sister looked down at her plate. My brother shifted in his chair but didn't say anything. My father continued, encouraged by the attention. I mean, we love them, he said, shrugging. But let's be honest. Not everyone is built to succeed. Then he said it. Calmly. Clearly. They're kind of the family's shame. The word hung in the air longer than any sound should. Shame. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. That made it worse. It was delivered like a conclusion he'd reached long ago, one he assumed everyone else had accepted as well. For a moment I felt the room tilt, not physically but internally. A familiar heat rose in my chest, followed by the instinct to disappear. I had imagined this moment before, though I never expected it to be so casual. I looked around. No one met my eyes. No one challenged him. No one told him he'd gone too far. That silence hurt more than the word itself. I could have spoken. I could have defended myself. I could have corrected him, listed facts, explained years of work he didn't see. I knew exactly what I could say. I said nothing. I stood up quietly, thanked my mother for dinner, and walked out. No one stopped me. The drive back to my apartment was long, even though it usually wasn't. Every red light felt heavier than the last. My father's voice replayed itself in my head, not louder but clearer each time. The word shame echoed, pulling memories with it, every comparison, every dismissal, every moment I learned to swallow my own worth. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I stood in the dark, keys still in my hand, letting the silence settle. There was no dramatic breakdown, no tears, just a deep, hollow stillness. That night wasn't about anger. It was about clarity. For the first time, I understood something. Without doubt, no amount of patience would change how my father saw me. No future achievement would rewrite the role he had assigned me. In his story, I was already finished. And that realization did something unexpected. It freed me. I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop, not to distract myself, but to review things I had been postponing. Documents, emails, timelines, decisions I had delayed out of habit, out of caution, out of not wanting to draw attention. I didn't make impulsive moves. I didn't act out of spite. I simply stopped hesitating. By the time I went to bed, something had shifted. Not externally, nothing visible had changed yet. But internally, the weight I had carried for years felt different, lighter, as if it had finally detached itself from my identity. The next morning, my phone buzzed earlier than usual. A missed call. From my father. I stared at the screen for a long moment before letting it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to hear his voice yet. And for the first time in my life, I realized I didn't owe him my immediacy. What I didn't know then, what no one knew, was that while my father slept comfortably in the certainty of his words, a reality he had never imagined was already moving into place. By the time he would see me again, the label he'd given me would no longer fit, and he would be the one struggling to find the right words. I didn't return my father's call that morning. Not because I was trying to punish him, but because I needed space to think without his voice bending my thoughts back into old shapes. I went to work as usual. Same route, same coffee, same neutral expression. From the outside, nothing about me looked different. Inside, everything was. For years, I had lived with a quiet contradiction. I downplayed my life to survive family gatherings while privately carrying responsibilities that demanded precision, discipline, and discretion. That contradiction had once felt necessary. Now, after hearing my father's words spoken aloud without shame, it felt outdated. By mid-morning, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room reviewing documents that most people never saw until it was too late. Contracts, ownership structures, voting rights, numbers with real weight behind them. The kind of paperwork that didn't make headlines but decided outcomes. This was the part of my life my family never asked about. It hadn't started dramatically. Years earlier, I had joined a small, struggling company in a technical role that sounded unimpressive. The salary was modest, the hours were long, and the future was uncertain. What the job offered quietly was proximity, access, a seat close enough to understand how decisions were actually made. While others chased titles, I learned processes. I watched how money moved before it was announced, how authority flowed through documents, not personalities. How people who talked the most in meetings often signed the least important pages. When the company nearly collapsed during my second year, most people panicked. Some left, some froze. I stayed. I read every contract line by line, not because it was my job, but because no one else wanted to. I noticed inconsistencies, risks, opportunities hidden in clauses most people skimmed. That was the first time someone senior looked at me differently. Not impressed. Curious. Over time, my role expanded, not loudly but deliberately. I was asked to sit in on meetings just to listen, then to review proposals, then to manage certain negotiations quietly. My name didn't appear in press releases. It appeared on documents that mattered. I accepted equity instead of raises when the option was offered. Not because I was confident, but because I understood leverage. I reinvested what little I earned. I signed agreements that tied my future to outcomes instead of appearances. I never told my family, not because I was ashamed, but because I had learned that information in my family was a weapon, and I had spent my life disarming myself just to keep the peace. As the years passed, the company stabilized. Then it grew. Slowly, at first, then unmistakably. We secured contracts that required strict confidentiality. Numbers climbed into figures that made people nervous. Lawyers became more involved. Boards formed. Governance structures tightened. And somewhere along the way, without ceremony, my position became central, not symbolic, operational. I had signing authority on agreements that moved millions of dollars. I had decision-making power that affected people who had never heard my name. I carried legal responsibility that didn't come with applause. That morning, after the dinner, I reviewed a finalized document that had been waiting for my approval. It had nothing to do with my father directly, at least not on the surface, but it intersected with something he depended on, something he had built his identity around. I signed. It wasn't impulsive. The decision had been coming for months. I had delayed it out of habit, out of caution, out of a reflexive desire not to disrupt familiar dynamics. Hearing my father call me the family's shame stripped that hesitation away. This wasn't retaliation. It was alignment. By noon, messages began appearing on my phone. Missed calls, emails marked urgent, not from family yet, but from people who suddenly realized a shift had occurred. The tone was respectful, careful, different from before. I answered them calmly. Professionally, I felt no rush of triumph, no surge of vindication, just clarity. For the first time, my internal reality and my external actions were in sync. Late that afternoon, my father called again. This time I answered. His voice sounded strained, though he tried to mask it. "We need to talk," he said. Not demanded. Asked. I told him I was busy and suggested a time the next day. There was a pause. A small one, but noticeable. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow works." That single word told me more than any apology could have. He hadn't questioned my availability. He hadn't pushed. The certainty I had grown up under was already cracking. After I hung up, I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment. Not to celebrate, to steady myself, because I knew what was coming. When my father finally saw the full picture, not the fragments he had dismissed, not the version of me he had frozen in time, it would force him to confront something deeper than a professional reversal. It would force him to confront how wrong he had been, and I wasn't sure how he would handle that. I finished my workday like any other, sent emails, reviewed schedules, made notes for the following week. On the surface, it was just another Tuesday, but beneath that routine, a threshold had been crossed. For years, I had kept my life compartmentalized, family over here, work over there, never allowing them to collide. That collision was now inevitable, and when it happened, it wouldn't be loud. It would be formal, documented, unavoidable. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in a long while, not because things were resolved, but because I had stopped carrying a story that wasn't mine to bear. The next day, my father would come looking for answers. What he would find instead was authority. My father arrived the next morning earlier than we had agreed. That alone told me something had shifted. He was never early for anyone, not for meetings, not for family, not even for himself. Punctuality in his mind was something other people owed him. When my phone buzzed with a message saying he was already downstairs, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Not fear, not anger, recognition. This was the moment when the story he had told himself for years was about to collide with reality. I didn't rush. I finished reviewing an email, closed my laptop, straightened the papers on my desk. Only then did I head down. He was standing near the entrance, hands clasped together, posture slightly stiff. He looked older than I remembered, though I'd seen him just days before. Not physically, something else. A certain certainty had drained out of him, leaving behind something cautious. When he saw me, he smiled. It was an awkward smile, unsure of itself. "Thanks for meeting me," he said. I nodded and gestured toward a small conference room nearby. Neutral territory, glass walls, professional lighting. I had chosen the location intentionally. Not to intimidate him, but to remove the familiar dynamics of kitchens and living rooms where he always held the upper hand. We sat across from each other. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I watched him adjust in his chair, glance briefly at the door, then back at me. He cleared his throat. "I didn't mean what I said the other night the way it came out," he began. I didn't respond. He continued, filling the silence quickly. "You know how those things go. Family jokes, a few drinks. People misunderstand." Still, I said nothing. He shifted again, his eyes flicking to the table between us, as if searching for something solid to hold on to. "There's been some confusion," he said carefully, "about a situation that came up yesterday." Now we were getting closer to the truth. I waited. He leaned forward slightly. "I was contacted by someone from a firm I've worked with for years. They said there were changes, structural changes, and that I should speak with you." That was the first time he acknowledged it directly, without dismissal, without sarcasm. He didn't accuse me. He didn't minimize it. He sounded uncertain. I folded my hands on the table. "There were no changes yesterday," I said evenly. "The changes happened months ago. Yesterday was just the formal execution." His eyes narrowed, not in anger but in confusion. "I don't understand," he said. "You're not involved in that way." I met his gaze calmly. "I am," I said. The room felt quieter after that. Not because of tension, but because something heavy had landed between us. He let out a small laugh, reflexive, defensive. "You mean consulting," he said. "Advising." "No," I replied. "I mean authority." That was the first time he looked genuinely unsettled. For years, my father had been comfortable misunderstanding me. It allowed him to keep his worldview intact. Now, confronted with a version of me that didn't fit, he searched for a way to reframe it back into something familiar. "So, you're saying," he said slowly, "you had some involvement, and now people think I don't think I interrupted gently. They know. Because it's documented." I slid a folder across the table. Not dramatically. Just enough for him to reach it without leaning too far. He hesitated before opening it. Inside were copies of agreements he recognized immediately. His expression shifted as he scanned the pages, not all at once but in stages. Confusion, recognition, alarm. He stopped reading and looked up at me. "These signatures," he said quietly. "They authorize." "Yes," I said. "And this role," he continued, tapping the page, "it says." "I know what it says," I replied. His hand trembled slightly as he closed the folder. "You never told us," he said. I didn't answer right away. "I wasn't asked," I said finally. "And I learned a long time ago that explaining myself to you didn't change anything." That landed harder than I expected. His shoulders dropped just a fraction. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "So what happens now?" he asked. There it was, the question that mattered. "What happens now," I said, "is exactly what was always going to happen. Processes continue. Contracts are honored. Decisions are reviewed according to the structure that's been in place." He swallowed. "And my role," I met his eyes again. "Your role hasn't changed," I said. "Your understanding of it has." Silence stretched between us. This time, he didn't rush to fill it. For the first time in my life, my father looked at me without assumption, without the shortcut of a label. He looked at me as someone he didn't fully know. That realization seemed to unsettle him more than any loss of control. "I didn't think you had this in you," he said quietly. I didn't take it as an insult. It wasn't meant to be one. It was an admission. "I know," I said. He nodded slowly, as if replaying years of conversations in his mind, searching for where he'd gone wrong. I didn't help him. This wasn't my burden to carry. When he finally stood to leave, his posture was different, less imposing, more careful. "I'll follow up through the proper channels," he said. "That would be best," I replied. At the door, he paused. About what I said, he began, then stopped. The apology didn't come. Not yet. Maybe it never would. Instead, he said, "I suppose I underestimated you." I watched him leave without responding. When the door closed behind him, I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded. Because for the first time, our relationship wasn't shaped by his certainty or my silence. It was shaped by reality. And reality, unlike his words, couldn't be taken back. The shift didn't announce itself with raised voices or slammed doors. It moved the way real power always does, quietly through emails, schedules, and people who suddenly became very careful with their words. Within hours of my father leaving that building, I began receiving confirmations. Calendar invites adjusted. Meeting agendas revised. A few calls came in, not urgent, not dramatic, but precise. The tone was consistent, respectful, measured, and unmistakably aware of where authority now rested. None of it felt new to me. It felt overdue. What changed was not my role, but how visible it had become to someone who had spent years refusing to see it. My father, on the other hand, was clearly struggling to recalibrate. He had built his identity on certainty, on knowing where he stood in every room, on being the final voice people deferred to. Now he was discovering that decisions affecting his work, his reputation, and his future were no longer filtered through him. They were filtered through structure, and that structure included me. Over the next few days, communication that once bypassed me now landed directly in my inbox. Legal counsel requested clarification on timelines. Board members asked for confirmation on compliance steps. A senior executive, someone my father had always spoken about with pride, addressed me formally for the first time. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't emphasize my title. I let the process speak. That process was about to become very public. A previously scheduled quarterly review was approaching one my father had always treated as routine. This time it wasn't. This time, the agenda included governance changes that required formal acknowledgement in front of multiple stakeholders. He couldn't avoid it. When we entered the conference hall that morning, the difference between us was impossible to ignore. Not in how we dressed or where we sat, but in how people oriented themselves. Questions that once went to him now paused, then shifted toward me. Clarifications were directed to my side of the table. My father noticed. I saw it in the tightening of his jaw, the way his hand hovered near his notes as if he needed something familiar to anchor him. The meeting began professionally. No tension, no confrontation, just structured discussion. Then the legal counsel stood and began reviewing documentation. Ownership percentages, voting rights, authority clauses. Numbers were projected on the screen, precise, undeniable. Percentages that didn't leave room for interpretation. Lines of text that established responsibility clearly and publicly. My father stared at the screen longer than necessary. When the counsel mentioned my role by name and title, the room remained calm. No one reacted dramatically. That was the most telling part. To everyone else, this wasn't a revelation. It was confirmation. The world hadn't changed overnight. My father's understanding had. When it came time for formal acknowledgement, the chair of the meeting turned toward me. "Do you confirm?" they asked. "I do," I replied. Then, inevitably, the attention shifted. "Any objections?" the chair asked, looking around the table. My father hesitated. This was the moment he would have seized in the past. The moment he would have challenged, redirected, reasserted himself. I watched him weigh his options, pride on one side, documentation on the other. He cleared his throat. "No objections," he said. The words were quiet, but the room heard them. From that point on, the dynamic was set. Questions were answered. Decisions were recorded. Processes moved forward without interruption. And just like that, the meeting ended. No one applauded. No one stared. People gathered their materials and left in orderly lines, discussing next steps like professionals who understood exactly what had occurred. As we stood to leave, my father remained seated for a moment, staring at the table as if it might explain how this had happened. When he finally looked up at me, his expression wasn't angry. It was unsettled. Outside the room, away from the formal structure, he spoke again. "They called you by title," he said. "Yes," I replied. "And everyone just accepted it." "They already had," I said. "Today was just the confirmation." He nodded slowly, as if absorbing the reality piece by piece. "I didn't know," he said. "I know," I replied. We walked together toward the exit, the space between us filled with something unfamiliar balance. For the first time, my father wasn't ahead of me or looming over me. He wasn't behind me either. He walked beside me, uncertain of where to place himself. At the door, he stopped. "So what do I call you now?" he asked. The question wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't playful. It was cautious. I considered it for a moment. "You can call me by my name," I said. "The title is for work." He hesitated, then nodded. "Right," he said. "Of course." Later that day, an email circulated summarizing the meeting outcomes. My role was referenced again, clearly, formally in writing. I knew my father would read it carefully, perhaps multiple times. I didn't forward it to him. I didn't highlight it. He didn't need help seeing what was already there. What struck me most wasn't the authority itself, it was how easily it existed without announcement, how little effort it took to maintain once it was established properly. For years I had been bracing for conflict that never came because the foundation had already been built. My father had built his influence on perception. I had built mine on structure. That difference mattered. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from him. Just 2 words. We should talk. I looked at the screen for a moment, then replied with a time. Not immediately. Not dismissively. On my terms. As I set the phone down, I felt something settle inside me. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Alignment. The power shift wasn't about dominance or revenge. It was about truth finally being acknowledged in a space where denial had ruled for decades. And the hardest part for my father was realizing that this truth hadn't appeared overnight. It had been growing quietly right in front of him all along. We met again 2 days later, but not in an office this time. The setting was more exposed, more symbolic, an industry luncheon hosted at a downtown venue my father had frequented for years. It was the kind of event where reputation mattered, where conversations traveled quickly, and where people remembered who deferred to whom. I hadn't planned it that way. The timing simply aligned. Still, when I arrived and saw my father across the room already mid-conversation with several familiar faces, I understood the weight of what was about to happen. This was his territory. Or at least it used to be. As I entered, a few heads turned. Subtle recognition. A nod here, a pause there. Nothing dramatic, just enough to signal awareness. I greeted people politely, exchanged brief pleasantries, and took my seat near the front where my name card had been placed without discussion. My father noticed. He paused mid-sentence when he saw where I was sitting. For a fraction of a second, his expression betrayed surprise. Then he recovered, smiling tightly as he finished his thought. The event began with introductions and acknowledgments. Names were read, roles were mentioned. When mine came up, it was stated clearly, confidently, without emphasis. No one reacted. That was the most unsettling part for him. As the program moved forward, discussions shifted toward upcoming initiatives, projects that intersected directly with decisions I now oversaw. Questions were asked, clarifications requested, and one by one people turned toward me. I answered calmly, precisely, without embellishment. My father remained silent longer than I had ever seen him in a public setting. He listened, watched, adjusted. At one point, a senior partner addressed the room. "We'll need final confirmation before proceeding," they said. "I believe that falls under your scope now." Their eyes settled on me. "Yes," I said. "I'll review and respond by end of week." It was routine, professional, unremarkable, except for what came next. My father shifted in his chair, then stood slightly as if to speak. The room paused, not because of him, but because it sensed an interruption. He hesitated, then spoke carefully. "If I may," he said, voice steady but restrained. "For scheduling purposes, you'll need to coordinate with—" He stopped. He glanced at me, then back at the room. With them," he finished. The hesitation didn't go unnoticed. The partner nodded politely. "Of course," they said. "We'll coordinate accordingly." The conversation moved on. My father sat back down slowly, his face unreadable. He didn't speak again for the remainder of the session. After the formal portion ended, people stood and mingled. Conversations broke into smaller circles. I found myself engaged in a discussion near the windows when I sensed someone behind me. "Excuse me," my father said quietly. I turned. Up close, he looked composed, but the tension in his shoulders hadn't disappeared. He gestured toward a quieter corner away from the crowd. I nodded and followed. For a moment, he didn't speak. He seemed to be choosing his words with unusual care. "You handled that well," he said finally. "Thank you," I replied. He exhaled slowly. "I didn't expect this," he admitted. "Not like this." I waited. "When they looked to you," he continued, "I realized something." "What's that?" I asked. "That this wasn't temporary," he said. "This isn't a technicality." "No," I agreed. "It's not." He nodded again, eyes lowering briefly. "I suppose," he said, voice quieter now, "that means I should adjust how I address you, at least in professional settings." There it was, the acknowledgement he had been circling for days. In those settings, he continued, "You're in charge." I studied him for a moment, not to judge, but to understand. This wasn't about me asserting power. It was about him relinquishing an illusion. "Yes," I said simply. He swallowed. "So," he said, clearing his throat, "how would you prefer I refer to you?" The question was careful, almost formal. I answered without hesitation. "By my title," I said. "When it's relevant." He nodded, absorbing it. "All right," he said. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "Boss." The word sounded unfamiliar in his mouth. Awkward. Forced. I didn't react. I didn't smile or correct him. I simply acknowledged it with a nod. The moment didn't feel triumphant. It felt heavy, necessary. Around us, conversations continued uninterrupted. No one stared. No one whispered. To them, this was simply how things were structured now. For my father, it was a reckoning. We stood there in silence for a few seconds longer than necessary. Then he straightened his jacket. "I'll follow up with your office," he said. "That would be appropriate," I replied. As he turned to leave, he stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, not looking at me, "I didn't see this coming." "I know," I said. He nodded once more and walked away, blending back into the crowd. I stayed where I was, watching the city beyond the glass. Cars moved below, unaware of the quiet shift that had just occurred above them. In that moment, I felt something settle inside me, not satisfaction, not relief, but resolution. The label he had given me, the one that had followed me through childhood, through silence, through years of restraint, had finally lost its power. Not because I argued against it, but because reality had outgrown it. He had called me the family's shame. Now, in a room where authority mattered and truth was documented, he had called me something else entirely. And he had done it publicly. Without argument. Without apology. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with raised voices or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a single word spoken carefully under the weight of undeniable truth. That word had finally been spoken. After that luncheon, my father didn't disappear. That surprised me. I had expected distance, maybe even resentment disguised as professionalism. Instead, what followed was something quieter and more complicated. He began reaching out, carefully, indirectly, emails that were overly formal, messages routed through assistants instead of sent directly, requests phrased as suggestions, not expectations. Each interaction carried the same underlying tension. He was trying to reintroduce himself into a dynamic where he no longer held the advantage without openly acknowledging the loss of it. For the first time in my life, I was watching him navigate uncertainty. A week after the event, he asked to meet again. This time it wasn't tied to any official agenda. No documents, no deadlines, just a conversation. I agreed, choosing a neutral cafe halfway between our offices, public enough to keep things contained, quiet enough to talk. He arrived on time. That alone told me how seriously he was taking this. We sat across from each other with coffee growing cold between us. He looked tired, not exhausted, worn, the kind of fatigue that comes from carrying a story for too long and realizing it no longer fits. "I've been thinking," he said, breaking the silence. "About everything." I didn't respond. I let him continue. "I keep replaying moments," he went on. "Conversations, decisions, things I said without thinking." He paused, then added, "Things I thought were harmless." I watched his hands as he spoke. They moved less than they used to, less certainty in their gestures. "You always kept to yourself," he said. "I told myself that meant you lacked ambition, that you didn't want more." I met his eyes calmly, and now I asked. He hesitated. Now I realize I never asked why. That was as close to an admission as I had ever heard from him. He took a breath. "I told myself I was motivating you, that being hard would make you stronger, that if you wanted recognition, you'd fight for it." I didn't interrupt. I had heard versions of this before, framed differently, justified endlessly. But he continued, "I think what I was really doing was rewarding the kind of ambition I understood, and dismissing the kind I didn't." There it was. Not an apology. Not yet. But recognition. "I didn't need you to understand my ambition," I said quietly. "I needed you not to define me by your version of it." He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that. "I know I can't change the past," he said. "And I'm not asking you to forget it." I waited. "I just want to understand where we stand now." That question mattered. Where we stand now. I considered it carefully. Not because I wanted to control him, but because clarity finally was possible. "We stand professionally aligned," I said. "Personally, we're recalibrating." He let out a small, dry laugh. "That sounds like something you'd put in a contract." "Clarity prevents misunderstandings," I replied. He smiled faintly at that, then grew serious again. "I don't expect special treatment," he said. "I know that's not how you operate." "You're right," I said. "It's not." He nodded. "I just don't want to be dismissed," he added quietly. The irony didn't escape me. For years, dismissal had been my role. Hearing him articulate that fear felt strange, not satisfying, not cruel, just revealing. "I don't dismiss people," I said. "I respond to how they show up." He looked down at his coffee. Then I need to show up differently, he said. That was the moment I realized something important. This wasn't an attempt to reclaim authority. It was an attempt to reclaim relevance. For years, my father had believed relevance came from dominance, from being the loudest voice in the room, from defining others before they could define themselves. Now, stripped of that advantage, he was learning something far more difficult. Relevance comes from respect, and respect isn't demanded. It's earned. I won't rewrite our history for your comfort, I said. But I'm not interested in punishing you either. He nodded. I wouldn't expect that, he said. Silence settled between us again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was reflective. I want to say something, he said after a moment, and I'm not sure how to say it. I waited. When I called you what I did, he said slowly, I thought I was stating a fact, something obvious. He swallowed. I was wrong. The words were simple, unadorned, no excuses attached. I didn't respond immediately. I don't need an apology for that moment alone, I said eventually. I need consistency going forward. He looked up. I can do that, he said. I won't be perfect, but I can be aware. Awareness was more than I had ever received before. As we stood to leave, he hesitated again. One more thing, he said. Yes, I'm proud of you, he said. The words sounded careful, as if he were testing them out loud. Not just for where you are, but for how you got there. I searched his face for expectation, for a need for reassurance. I found none, just uncertainty. Thank you, I said. That was all. We parted without drama. No embrace. No grand reconciliation. Just two people acknowledging a shift that had been long overdue. Walking back to my car, I felt lighter, but not because I had been validated. Because I no longer needed validation from him to stand where I stood. That conversation didn't erase years of silence or reshape my childhood. It didn't need to. What it did was establish something new, an adult boundary built on reality, not roles. My father was learning to meet me where I was, and I was finally free to let him. The resolution didn't arrive with a single signature or a dramatic announcement. It unfolded the way most real consequences do, methodically, through systems that don't care about pride or history. In the weeks following that conversation, the legal framework surrounding our work moved from transition to permanence. Reviews were completed, compliance checks finalized. Decisions that had once lived in drafts were executed fully. The structure that had been quietly supporting my role was now locked in place. For my father, this meant adjustment, not symbolic but practical. Processes he once initiated now required formal requests. Timelines he once dictated were now subject to review. Meetings he once chaired were now scheduled through channels that included me by default. No one treated him unfairly. No one diminished his contributions. But the era of assumption was over. He felt it most during the first major approval cycle. A proposal landed on my desk late one afternoon, one that my father had helped shape and strongly supported. It was solid, thoughtful, but it carried risk that needed addressing. I flagged the issues, requested revisions, and sent it back with comments. An hour later, my phone rang. It was him. I saw your notes, he said, voice controlled. I think some of those concerns are overly cautious. Explain why, I replied. He did, calmly, thoroughly, without the edge he once used to shut conversations down. I listened. I understand your perspective, I said when he finished, but the risk remains. Address it and we can move forward. There was a pause. All right, he said finally. I'll revise it. No argument. No escalation. That was the moment I knew this wasn't temporary. Because he wasn't testing boundaries anymore. He was respecting them. From the outside, nothing about our dynamic looked extraordinary. Two professionals, collaborating within defined roles. That was the point. Justice for me wasn't about watching him struggle. It was about watching the system work exactly as it was designed to, without favoritism, without emotion clouding judgment. For the first time, my father was subject to the same standards he had always imposed on others. And for the first time, he didn't resent it. At a subsequent review meeting, a question arose about a past decision one my father had made years earlier, long before I held authority. The issue wasn't misconduct but oversight, a gray area that needed clarification. All eyes turned to me. How do you want to proceed? Someone asked. I glanced at my father briefly, then back to the table. We document the context, I said. Correct the process moving forward. No retroactive penalties. My father looked at me, not surprised but relieved. That choice mattered. It reinforced something essential. My authority wasn't built on settling scores. It was built on fairness, on applying standards consistently, even when doing so benefited the person who had once dismissed me. After the meeting, my father approached me quietly. "Thank you," he said, "for being measured." "That's the job," I replied. He nodded. Over time, the tension that had defined our interactions began to fade. Not because we forgot the past, but because the present demanded something different. Our conversations became clearer, shorter, more honest. He no longer tried to explain himself unnecessarily. He no longer softened his requests with self-deprecation. He simply showed up, prepared, respectful, and aligned with the process, and I responded in kind. One evening, weeks later, we found ourselves walking out of the same building, headed in opposite directions. He stopped before reaching his car. "You know," he said, "I used to think authority came from being right all the time." I waited. "Now I see it comes from being accountable," he continued. "Even when it's uncomfortable." I nodded. "That's what lasts." He smiled faintly at that. "I wish I'd learned it sooner," he said. "So do I replied, not accusing, not forgiving, just stating truth. That night I reflected on how easily this could have gone differently, how tempting it would have been to weaponize the moment, to assert dominance where I had once been diminished. But that wouldn't have brought resolution. Justice isn't about reversal, it's about balance. The balance had finally been restored, not through confrontation, but through structure, through documentation, through quiet consistency. My father had called me the family's shame because he didn't recognize value that didn't look like his own. The system we now operated within didn't share that limitation. It recognized contribution, accountability, and outcome. And in that system, I didn't need to be defended. I was already established. By the time the final approvals were filed and archived, there was nothing left to prove. The work spoke, the records held. The hierarchy was clear. My father adjusted fully, not because he was forced to, but because resisting it no longer made sense. And in that acceptance, something unexpected happened. We both found peace. Not the kind that erases history, but the kind that allows it to rest. The change in my father didn't announce itself all at once. It revealed itself in small, almost invisible ways, the kind you only notice if you've spent a lifetime studying someone closely. Family gatherings resumed cautiously. Birthdays, holidays, quiet dinners that used to feel like tests I could never pass. This time the atmosphere was different. Not warm, not healed, but adjusted. My father spoke less. That alone altered the room. When he did speak, he asked questions instead of delivering conclusions. He listened longer than he used to, and most noticeably, he stopped speaking for me. At the first family dinner after everything settled, my sister asked how work was going. The question was casual, almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure what version of me she was allowed to acknowledge now. I answered simply, honestly. No numbers, no titles. "It's steady," I said. "Demanding." She nodded, accepting that without pushing for more. My brother watched quietly from across the table. He didn't challenge me. He didn't joke. Later, he pulled me aside. "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't share," I replied. He nodded. Fair. That was the closest thing to an apology I needed from him. What surprised me most was how my father behaved when others were present. In the past, he had defined me publicly and softened things privately, if at all. Now the reverse was happening. In private, he was still learning, still awkward, still unsure where to place his regret. But in public, he was careful. When someone asked about my work, he didn't interrupt. When someone praised my contribution, he didn't redirect the credit. When introductions were made, he used my name, nothing more, nothing less. That restraint mattered. One evening, after everyone had left and the house had settled into quiet, he and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen. The same kitchen where I had once learned to keep my answers short and my presence minimal. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. "I notice things now," he said suddenly. "Like what I asked. Like how often I spoke over you," he said. "How often I decided who you were without checking if I was right." I didn't respond immediately. Not because I disagreed, but because I didn't want to rush the moment. "I thought certainty was strength," he continued. "I thought doubt was weakness." He shook his head slightly. "You lived with doubt, and still built something solid." "That's because doubt makes you careful," I said. "Careful people don't overlook consequences." He smiled faintly at that. "I used to call that hesitation," he said. "I know," I replied. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective. The kind that only comes after conflict has passed and there's nothing left to defend. Over time, extended family adjusted too. The labels they had absorbed from my father lost their grip. Some asked questions, some didn't. Most simply accepted the shift without comment. People are surprisingly adaptable when reality makes denial inconvenient. What didn't change was my approach. I didn't correct anyone who still underestimated me. I didn't demand recognition at the family table. I didn't rewrite my history to make others comfortable. I let things settle naturally. The work continued. The responsibilities remained. The authority stayed where it belonged, quietly, firmly, without needing to be announced. One afternoon, months later, my father forwarded me an email chain by mistake. In it, someone had asked for his approval on a matter outside his scope. His reply was short. "You'll need to check with them. No explanation, no defensiveness, just fact." I stared at that message longer than I expected to. It wasn't about the deference, it was about the acceptance. That night, I realized something I hadn't anticipated. I no longer replayed his words in my head. The ones from childhood, the comparisons, the dismissals. Even the word shame had faded into something distant, stripped of its sting. Not because he had apologized perfectly, but because my life no longer revolved around disproving him. I had built something independent of his approval, his understanding, and his expectations. And in doing so, I had outgrown the role he assigned me. One evening, as we were saying goodbye after dinner, he hesitated at the door. "I don't say this enough," he said, "but I respect the way you carry yourself." I nodded. "That means something," he added. "Coming from me." "I know," I said. And I did. What we had now wasn't a rewritten past or a perfect reconciliation. It was something more realistic and more durable. Mutual recognition. My father no longer needed me to fit his definition of success, and I no longer needed him to validate my worth. The family had recalibrated. Quietly, imperfectly, but truthfully. And in that recalibration, I finally felt something I hadn't expected to feel at all. At ease. By the time everything settled, there was no single moment I could point to and say, this is where it ended. Resolution didn't arrive like a door slamming shut. It arrived like a room, finally going quiet after years of noise. Life moved on. Work continued with the same steady pressure it always had. Decisions still landed on my desk. Responsibilities still followed me home in the evenings, heavy but familiar. Authority, once fully established, stopped feeling like something I carried and started feeling like something I simply inhabited. At home, my routines remained unchanged. Morning coffee. Emails before sunrise. Long walks when my thoughts needed space. The difference was internal. I no longer felt the need to brace myself before family interactions. No rehearsed answers. No defensive silences. No quiet tally of imagined judgments. That alone felt like freedom. One Sunday afternoon, months after the luncheon, my father asked if I wanted to walk with him around the neighborhood. It was a simple invitation delivered without expectation. We walked side by side, passing houses that looked just like the one I grew up in, orderly, unremarkable, hiding entire histories behind their doors. For a while we didn't speak. I used to think he said eventually that if I pushed hard enough I could shape outcomes, shape people. I listened. I didn't understand that pressure doesn't create strength, he continued. It just reveals it, or crushes it. I glanced at him briefly, then back at the road. I survived it, I said. But I didn't become strong because of it. I became strong in spite of it. He nodded, accepting that without protest. I know I can't undo what I said, he added, or what I believed for so long. I don't need you to undo it, I replied. I needed it to stop defining me. He stopped walking for a moment, as if the words required stillness. Then he nodded again, and continued forward. That was the last time we spoke directly about the past, not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer demanded attention. At the next family gathering, nothing extraordinary happened. There were no announcements, no acknowledgements, just conversation, food, and the subtle ease of people who had adjusted their expectations to reality. When someone asked my father about me, he answered simply, "They're doing well." No qualifiers, no comparisons, no corrections. It was enough. Later that night, as I drove home, I thought about how much of my life had been shaped by a single word spoken, repeatedly, casually, without consideration for its weight. Shame. A label that had followed me quietly, shaping how others saw me and how I learned to see myself. What I understood now was this shame only has power when you accept it as truth. I hadn't fought it loudly. I hadn't rejected it dramatically. I had outgrown it patiently. And that I realized was why the reversal had felt so calm. My father calling me boss hadn't elevated me. It had simply aligned his language with reality. The work had already been done. The foundation had already been laid. The justice wasn't in the word itself, it was in the years of quiet preparation that made the word unavoidable. In the end, I didn't win by being louder. I won by being consistent. I won by letting systems speak when emotions failed, by letting documentation replace argument, by letting time expose what noise tried to hide. There are people who will never understand your path because it doesn't resemble theirs. People who mistake silence for weakness and patience for fear. Their misunderstanding isn't your failure. It's simply their limitation. If there's anything my story taught me, it's this: you don't need to demand recognition from those who underestimate you. Reality has a way of correcting false narratives, slowly, methodically, and without asking permission. And when it does, the moment isn't explosive. It's quiet, grounded, final. If you've ever been labeled by someone who never took the time to truly see you, if you've ever been dismissed because your strength didn't look the way they expected, know this: you are not required to prove yourself on their timeline, in their language, or by their standards. Sometimes the most powerful response is to keep building, in silence. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share what part stayed with you the most, or where you're listening from and what time it is there. And if you'd like to hear more stories about quiet strength, delayed justice, and standing tall without shouting, consider subscribing. You're not alone in this.